So another idea I had kind of taking away from the book is I felt like there's a lot of times where Ray's interacting with people, whether it be colleagues or investors, and he's talking about things as like, hey, I've got wealthy doing this, and that's why you should do what I'm doing. Except that, the old saying is, Wall Street has an incentive to sell you something, but you might not have the same incentive to buy it. On a 2 and 20 structure, Ray was going to get wealthier than everybody else almost regardless. And they don't collect a 2 and 20. Did you get the sense also that there was that real detachment between what his incentives were and him kind of, I don't want to say maybe obfuscating isn't the right word, but conflating that with what his investors' incentives are? Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, I have a few different answers for that. One is I can tell you as a finance reporter, it's always struck me that asset management is a great way to build wealth for the asset manager.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's
Amen
always
to that,
a great
by the
way.
way. I can speak to that.
The so hedge funds traditionally charge 2 and 20. They charge 2% of your assets under management every year. Plus they take 20% cut of what you earn, even the beta, by the way, even just the market performance. You don't have to beat the market to be paying them a lot of money in performance fees. Now, what Ray does is, and this gets to be really so important as a part of his story, which is that because he's getting wealthier and wealthier, he's able to tell people, and he literally says this phrase to people in the book. He says, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? He's saying that the fact that he's getting wealthier and wealthier is making him more and more of an authority on things in life, not just, by the way, in investing. And in this way, it's sort of he's one of the more relatable figures. He could even remind you of, say, former President Trump, who, when he was running for president, he was saying, you should trust me because I ran all these very successful businesses. I can run the country too. Ray really has a similar approach, but just inside his own fund.
Well, yeah, and I think when he was obscuring the idea of I'm wealthier, therefore I'm smarter, and the wealthier I get, the smarter I am than everybody. The way to profit in a society doesn't necessarily always require intelligence. It just means you found a way to profit in society. And I think those two things get confused very often, I would say, even by the public, not uncommonly. So, here he is, he's getting wealthier. In his mind, he's smarter and smarter and smarter. And this begats, a long discussion of the book. I feel like a lot of the book, and maybe even as the author, I don't think you totally understood this because the reader walks away not understanding it, but these principles, he's espousing these principles. I'm wealthy, I'm smart, here's my principle. So here's my kind of bizarre question. Were these principles or rules, were they just created as rules? Were they supposed to be guidelines? Or in many cases, they almost came off as cliches? How do you look at these ideas that he was saying as ways for people to go out and live and make decisions based on?
He would be very offended to hear you call them cliches,
Okay.
But I won't argue on.
I don't think he cares,
that.
Probably, but
no, I don't think he. Well, he cares very deeply, actually, about his reputation. But so after he becomes incredibly wealthy, after he becomes a billionaire, around 2005, he starts to search for sort of a higher level meaning in life. And he starts to come up with these things called principles. And he calls them nothing short of principles for life and work. And they start out as, say, 5. There's about 5 or 10 of them inside Bridgewater. And then they expand to dozens. Then there are hundreds. And these are, as you would put it, these are aphorisms, essentially. And they're instructions for how we should act. So what they come down to, and I'll get back to your point on cliche, is the greatest summary of these is actually a principle itself. One of his principles is that pain plus reflection equals progress. So that if we are willing to put up with some pain, then if we think about it afterwards, that it will sort of improve us and improve our lives. So the great fun of the book for me, frankly, is not necessarily just the story of his investing, but it's the story of these principles just running wild and how he applies pain plus reflection equals progress. Now, do I think that Ray truly buys into this all? My answer to that is I have to believe he buys into it. Because the cruelness of them and the way that he acts for the majority of this book it would be so monstrous for someone to act that way if they didn't fully believe in it, that I choose to believe that he believes. But I truly don't know.
Well, and I think, to your point, I don't think a reader or understander of his story, to your point, would say, oh, I don't think he believes in this. But I think even, through your writing, it's easy to understand why Ray had trouble applying all these principles, because it's like you say, hey, here's the things you need to know. And I think there was one part in the story where someone comes in and says, like, there's 10 commandments, there's 14 principles of these other companies. There's 200 rules in this case. It's almost not applicable because there's a lot of things that contradict each other. So how do you apply these principles? I think even for Ray, that becomes the trouble on a day-to-day basis. You think that's a fair way of putting it?
Definitely. And by the way, the man who comes in and tells him that is not just anyone, it's the CEO of Bridgewater who says that to him. And you would think, by the way, for a man, Ray Dalio, who says that he's, I can put up with the pain. I want the reflection. I want your feedback. Anyone can give me feedback. When he is given that feedback by his own CEO, by John Rubinstein, who was a top deputy to Steve Jobs at Apple, Ray just ignores it. And again, I find it very, very relatable as part of the reason why I love the book. And I think that it really has lessons for us all, because okay, if I were a multi-billionaire and I had staked my entire career on the invention of these so-called principles, I too would probably, my instinct would be to ignore the feedback. Why would I want to listen to you?
Sure.
You work for me. This is my whole reputation. This is my whole legacy are these principles. It's funny. One of the reviews that I got on the book was, I think it was a New York Times review, actually, or a New Yorker. It was said something like, this is a book where Ray contemplates retirement on page 70. They're basically saying I skipped his life story because I was more interested in sort of his and what he does after he's thinking about his legacy. And
Sure.
I would say absolutely, that is what I'm most interested in. Is what would you do if you had achieved everything possible in life, every possible economic advantage? You would bought the most expensive home in Connecticut, and then you bought the second most expensive home that was next to yours and left it empty so that no one would live next to you. You honestly might act a lot of the ways that he does.
Sure.
You might just focus on your own reputation. And that's what I find so fun about this book.
Well, to your point, it wasn't, like he could do anything he wanted, but yet running Bridgewater, the legacy of Bridgewater, that continued to be his biggest work regardless of the net worth. In other words, there was nothing that he could buy that would please or fill that legacy building. Who am I affecting? Where is this going? And how can people draw from my experience and my knowledge? And that drove him a lot. So you mentioned a little bit about the management team. So can you teach us about the management committee, or what you call the MC cycle at Bridgewater? This was just intriguing.
So in order to explain that, I think it's important just as a brief reminder for anyone who hasn't read the book, and obviously everyone should. You should buy 20 copies each. It's even better
Amen.
With the 20th. Is that at Bridgewater, everything is recorded. So it's called radical transparency. And what Ray and Bridgewater say is that things at Bridgewater are more open, and that decision-making is public to everyone inside Bridgewater. So keep in mind that everything, even this conversation, would be recorded right up to the management committee, essentially the board of directors for the company. And so ostensibly, this is an opportunity for, sunlight is the best disinfectant, that everyone can see why we make decisions, and you can agree or disagree, but at least right? But in practice, what Ray starts to do is what others call the MC cycle, the management committee cycle, which is he will bring in an employee to be, say, CEO or to be a top deputy to him, put them on the management committee, make sure the cameras are rolling, and then start to embarrass them. Start to give them tasks that they obviously can't do. Start to put them on trials, on videotape trials, and to show people that they're messing up. And again, this is a principle. This is pain plus reflection equals progress. So there's a case very relatively early on where he brings someone in who's a friend, by the way, a friend of the firm, who's a former investor of the firm's, and he brings him in to be CEO. And on his one of his very first days, Ray says to him, he says, "You're not CEO." He says, "You're going to have to earn this." And of course, he never does earn it. And he's gone 6 months later.
Sure. Did Ray really care about wilted peas in the cafeteria?
So there's a bit in the book, there's a lot, frankly, about Bridgewater invents what they call an issue log, which
Sure.
is this constant running, say, spreadsheet of complaints. Because one of the principles is that there's no such thing as a small problem. And that applies even to wilted peas in the cafeteria.
Okay.
So one of the complaints that comes in on the issue log one day is that the peas in the cafeteria are looking a bit sad. And Ray does get involved, and he turns this into an excuse to investigate the cafeteria staff. I'm not sure that he actually, if you hooked him up to a lie detector test, cares about the peas. But he definitely does believe that wilted peas are a sign of some greater rot, no pun intended, in the organization. And I think, though I never say it in the book quite intentionally, what I definitely want the reader to think is, why is it that everyone and everything at Bridgewater can be investigated for rot, except for Ray himself?